All right, buckle up, folks, because on today's deep dive, we are diving headfirst into hurricane season. And no, we're not just talking about your run-of-the-mill wind and rain. We're tackling some, well, let's just say interesting theories about hurricanes, things like CGI creations, shady umbrella conspiracies, and, get this, government-orchestrated foam parties. Yeah, you heard that right. I did some exploring online, so you don't have to. And let me tell you, it was a wild ride.
Yeah.
So to help us separate, hopefully, the fact from the fiction, we have an expert standing by. Welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
So let's start with, well, this one, everything we see about hurricanes is fake, like a meticulously crafted CGI. It's almost like someone took the moon landing conspiracy and, well, gave it a weather-themed twist.
It's definitely an interesting idea, I'll give you that. But just think about it for a second. The sheer scale of something like that, of that deception, would be unbelievable. I mean, you're talking about fabricating these massive weather events, right? Events that span hundreds of miles, impact millions of people, and are verified by tons of independent sources.
Yeah, it's not just one camera crew we're talking about here. I mean,
Yeah.
we have satellites, radar, and of course, all the people who live through these storms every year.
Precisely. The complexity of faking something like that consistently over time, it just wouldn't work. And it really discounts, I think, the very real science behind hurricanes, which is based on decades and decades of research.
Okay, so if we can agree that hurricanes aren't some, figment of someone's CGI imagination, what about this, that the Weather Channel is in cahoots with the, wait for it, the umbrella industry, hyping up hurricanes to boost umbrella sales? What do you even say to something like that?
Well, it's a good example of how our brains love to find patterns, even when they don't actually exist. Confirmation bias.
Right, confirmation bias.
Like if you already tend to distrust, let's say, authority figures like the media or big corporations, you might be more likely to believe something like this.
So it's easier to believe in a big conspiracy than to wrap your head around how weather forecasting actually works. Okay, so rather than some massive, global conspiracy, it's more about how our brains are wired, that we try to connect the dots, even if they're totally random.
Exactly.
Interesting. So speaking of faulty logic, let's talk about this hurricane eye theory, where apparently the calm in the center of the storm isn't natural. It's actually some kind of government device, a surveillance device. Can you believe that one?
No, that's a new one. The eye of the hurricane is fascinating, sure, but it's definitely not some secret government project. It's all about the physics of how hurricanes work. So as the air rises in a hurricane, it creates an area of low pressure at the center. And then the air rushes in to fill this void, spinning faster and faster, and that ultimately creates a calm center in the middle of all the chaos.
So not a surveillance device, but still a pretty amazing example of how powerful nature can be.
Yeah, nature's fascinating all on its own.
Yeah.
But I understand why these theories pop up.
Right, like there's this human need to believe in something. Or maybe just to feel more in control when faced with something as powerful and unpredictable as a hurricane.
I think that's a big part of it. These theories often stem from, a distrust of authority, for sure, and wanting simple explanations for complicated events.
So how do we balance this, like this fascination with these outlandish ideas and the need for accurate information, which is obviously very important when it comes to something like hurricane preparedness?
That's a big question for sure. I mean, it really comes down to, finding that sweet spot between our very human need to question and explore, but also like being realistic, right? Grounding ourselves in the evidence.
And when it comes to hurricanes, I mean, the evidence shows us they are incredibly powerful. I mean, you're probably already familiar with how hurricanes form, but it's amazing to me how these storms aren't just local events. They have this huge impact on like everything from ocean currents to like global temperatures.
It's true, they're like these massive engines, redistributing heat from the tropics and moving it towards the poles. And, when they do that, they actually churn up colder water from the bottom of the ocean. It's this process called upwelling. And it's actually good for marine life over time.
So it's almost like this reset button for the ocean. Like obviously destructive in the short term, but in the long run, it plays this vital role.
Yeah, exactly. But even with those positive side effects, we can't forget about the danger hurricanes pose, especially for coastal communities.
Right, and speaking of danger, let's move past the more outlandish claims and talk about something that is a very real threat: storm surge. I hear that term all the time, but I'm not sure I fully understand it.
So imagine a bulldozer, but made of water, being driven onto the shore by a hurricane's winds. That's basically storm surge. And it can flood huge areas, causing catastrophic flooding that, reaches miles inland. And we're not just talking about water either. It carries debris, down power lines, even marine life with it. It's incredibly dangerous.
So even if a hurricane's eye is passing overhead, if you're on the coast, you're still in danger.
Exactly, which is why it's so important to follow evacuation orders. People, they really underestimate the power of water, and they overestimate their own ability to, just ride out the storm.
And that actually reminds me of another theory we came across, that hurricanes are just an excuse to cancel vacations, and that somehow the travel industry is in on it. I have to admit, I laughed when I read that one.
It's definitely out there.
Yeah.
But it does highlight how big of an economic impact hurricanes have. These storms can be devastating for local economies. I mean, they shut down businesses, they disrupt tourism, they cause billions and billions of dollars in damage.
And of course, we can't forget about the human cost. The loss of life, of homes, of livelihoods, it's impossible to measure.
It really is, which is why being prepared is so crucial. Knowing your evacuation route, having an emergency kit, staying informed, these aren't just suggestions. They can save your life.
So knowing what sources to trust is a big part of that, right? We have to be able to tell the difference between what's real and what's not, between the real dangers and the conspiracy theories. How do we do that? How do we become more discerning, especially with something as important as a hurricane?
It's a great question, and it's something that goes way beyond just hurricanes. It's really about how to handle the information landscape of the 21st century, and that's what we'll look into in the next segment.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've gone from some, pretty out there hurricane conspiracies to, the hard science behind these incredible storms. But something we haven't talked about yet is how to find good information, which is pretty important when you think about it.
It really is. It's like we live in a world where information spreads so fast, but not all of it is accurate. Just because you see something on social media or hear it from a friend doesn't make it true.
Yeah, it's like that saying, don't believe everything you read on the internet.
Yeah.
Which is harder than ever these days.
Totally.
Yeah.
So how do we figure out what to trust, especially with something as important as a hurricane? I think the first thing is to, look at where the information is coming from. Is it a reputable news source?
Yeah.
A government agency?
Yeah.
Something like NOAA.
Right, NOAA.
Or, a well-respected scientific organization.
Those all seem like good places to start. What about the opposite? Like, what are some red flags, things to watch out for?
Honestly, I think a lot of it is just trusting your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. Like, look for really sensational headlines, or language that's super emotionally charged, or if there's just no real evidence to back up what they're saying. Those are usually pretty good indicators that you might be looking at misinformation.
So going back to those theories we talked about earlier, the ones about CGI hurricanes and the umbrella conspiracy, how do we decide what to believe when something seems so crazy?
Well, that's where critical thinking comes in. Don't just believe something because it sounds good or because it fits with what you already believe. Question things. Look for evidence from different places and be open to the idea that you might be wrong.
That's good advice in general, I think.
It is.
Question everything.
Exactly. And especially when it comes to scientific topics like hurricanes. Make sure the explanations you're seeing are based on actual science. Does it make sense with what we already know about meteorology, physics, climate change? These are fields that have been studied for, decades, centuries even. It's not just someone's opinion they posted online.
So it's about doing your homework, not just reading the headline, but really trying to understand the information.
Yeah, and thinking about who's giving you that information and what their motivation might be.
It all makes sense when you put it like that. So as we wrap up this deep dive, are there any go-to resources you recommend? Places our listeners can go for trustworthy information on hurricanes or other natural disasters?
Definitely. For solid science-based hurricane info, I always go to NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They've got everything real-time hurricane tracking, articles on hurricane science, everything you could need, really.
That's great to know.
Yeah, and don't forget about your local news. They usually have meteorologists who can give you more localized info, especially during severe weather.
All great tips. And as always, we encourage you to do your own research, stay curious, and never stop asking questions. We've just scratched the surface here, but hopefully this has given you the tools to keep exploring this fascinating world of hurricanes, and more importantly, to navigate the sometimes confusing world of information out there. Because when it comes to something as powerful as a hurricane, being a little skeptical and thinking critically might be the best protection of all.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It's been great talking about this with you today. And remember, figuring out what's real and what's not is a process. but it's a process worth going through.
Totally agree. And until next time, happy diving, everyone.